We moved in together when I was 18, barely adults, sharing a cramped dorm room with mismatched furniture and a tiny bed that we squeezed into like sardines. But it didn't matter. Claire and I had each other, and back then, that felt like enough. She was still in her final year of school, and every day she'd come back with stories about her classmates and her plans for the future. I'd sit and listen, letting her excitement fill up the small space like sunlight. I wasn't just her boyfriend. I was her whole world, and she was mine. Our love wasn't flashy. It wasn't one of those movie romances with dramatic gestures or over-the-top confessions. It was built on quiet moments, late-night talks, shared meals, the way she'd fall asleep with her head on my shoulder while we watched something dumb on my old laptop. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. 17 years. 17 years of building a life together, of late nights worrying about bills, vacations we saved for months to afford, and lazy weekends spent in our own bubble. We'd grown up together. Our love had roots that ran deep, and I thought those roots could weather anything. It turns out some storms are stronger than we think. It started with a phone call, one of those casual, middle-of-the-week interruptions that you don't think twice about until later. Claire answered the call and spent a few minutes chatting before calling out to me with a grin. "It's Ashley," she said, holding her hand over the phone. "She's organizing a reunion. 20 years since graduation. Can you believe it?" Ashley was one of Claire's oldest friends from school, a loud, bubbly woman who somehow stayed in our lives even after years of changes and distance. Claire always lit up when she talked to Ashley, like she was 17 again. And now Ashley wanted us to come to this reunion. Claire couldn't hide her excitement. Her whole face was glowing. "They're inviting everyone," she said, scrolling through the email invite on her phone. "They've rented a big hall and everything. It'll be amazing." I smiled at her, even though I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending an evening with people I hadn't seen in decades. But seeing Claire so excited made it impossible to say no. She started planning everything down to the last detail. What she'd wear, how she'd do her hair, even what shoes she'd bring as backups in case her heels got uncomfortable. I didn't think much of it at first. Claire always liked to look nice. But then she came home one evening with a shopping bag in hand and a look of triumph on her face. "You're not ready for this," she said, pulling out a dress and holding it up like it was a trophy. It was black, leather, short. I blinked, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that the dress wasn't beautiful. It was bold. Something more fitting for a night out at a club than a reunion. "Wow," I said slowly. "That's something." Claire laughed. "It's perfect, isn't it?" I nodded, not wanting to dim her excitement. "Yeah, it's definitely something." She didn't notice my hesitation. Or if she did, she brushed it off. In her mind, this wasn't just a dress. It was a way of showing everyone, herself included, that she was still young, still confident. I told myself it didn't matter what she wore. What mattered was that she was happy. The day of the reunion arrived, and Claire spent hours getting ready. I watched her curl her hair in front of the mirror, her face set with concentration. She caught my reflection in the glass and smiled. "Nervous?" she asked, teasing. "Not really," I lied. Truthfully, I wasn't nervous, but something felt off, a faint hum of unease that I couldn't quite shake. I pushed the feeling down, telling myself that it was just nostalgia making me weird. When we arrived at the hall, we were greeted by a wave of familiar but older faces. People hugged and laughed, swapping stories about their kids, their jobs, their lives. It was strange seeing everyone again after so long, but also comforting in a way. The night was going well. Claire was radiant, surrounded by old friends who couldn't get enough of her. I stayed by her side for a while before drifting towards some of the other husbands, making small talk over beer. And then he walked in. Johnny. If there's ever been someone who could make me feel like I was 18 again for all the wrong reasons, it was him. We were rivals in every sense of the word. From sports to test scores, from who got invited to more parties to who could charm the teachers better. It was always a competition. But it wasn't fun. It was personal. He was late, of course, making a grand entrance like he always did. He was dressed casually, but with just enough flair to draw attention. Shirt unbuttoned, just enough to hint at the gym sessions he clearly still kept up with. I felt a flicker of insecurity, a reminder that some parts of me still hadn't grown up. Claire spotted Johnny before I did. Her eyes lit up in recognition, and she waved him over. My stomach tightened as he walked toward us, his grin as smug as ever. He hugged her a little longer than necessary, and gave me a nod that was more of a dismissal than a greeting. The conversations blurred after that. Claire had another glass of wine, then another, her laugh getting louder, her gestures more animated. When someone mentioned continuing the night at an after-party, she was the first to cheer. I leaned in and whispered, "Maybe we should head home. We've had a good night." She pulled back, her face full of that wild energy that used to make me fall in love with her, but now felt unfamiliar. "Let's live a little, okay? Just this once." Those words, "just this once," dug into me. Johnny announced that he already had a place rented, and the crowd erupted in applause. Claire's eyes shone, and I felt myself shrinking beside her. We ended up at his rented house, a sleek, modern place with an open floor plan and way too much alcohol. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the whole night felt like something out of a teenage fever dream. I did my best to relax, sipping my beer and pretending I wasn't keeping track of Claire's every movement. But as the night dragged on, the pit in my stomach grew. Something was wrong. I couldn't find her. I pushed my way through the house, weaving between old classmates who'd had too much to drink. And then I saw her. She was stepping out of a side room, adjusting her dress, with Johnny right behind her, his hand brushing the doorframe as if to steady himself. His shirt was wrinkled, and Claire was wiping the corner of her mouth. My world froze. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My brain scrambled for any rational explanation. Something innocent, something harmless. But the way Johnny avoided my eyes, and the way Claire tried to force a smile that didn't reach her eyes, told me everything I needed to know. She saw me standing there and hurried toward me, her voice too bright, too fake. "It's not what you think." She laughed, an unsteady, awkward sound. "We were just messing around. Johnny thought it would be funny to prank you." "A prank? No cameras." No audience waiting to shout, "Gotcha." Just silence. And that empty, gnawing look on Johnny's face as he quietly slipped past me toward the front door, his head down like a guilty kid caught stealing. Claire reached out for my arm, her fingers brushing my sleeve as if she could pull me back with that one small touch. "Please," she whispered, "just hear me out." I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My throat was dry, and my hands were shaking. I turned away and headed toward the front door. Behind me, I heard her shoes clicking against the floor as she followed me, her voice cracking. It wasn't what it looked like. "Please don't walk away." But I didn't stop. I opened the door, stepped out into the night, and kept walking until I reached my car. She grabbed the passenger door handle as I opened the driver's side. "Please, let's go home together. Just talk to me." I looked at her for the briefest second before I got in and slammed the door shut. The sound of it echoed in the cool night air. She stood there, watching me through the glass with wide, tear-filled eyes. I turned the key in the ignition, and with a quiet hum, the car came to life. I drove off without looking back. The road blurred around me, trees and streetlights flashing by as my pulse throbbed in my ears. The logical part of my mind told me to stop somewhere, to calm down before I did something reckless. But the other part, the part that was drowning in anger and betrayal, wanted to keep driving until I forgot where I was. When I finally got home, the silence felt heavier than it ever had. The house that Claire and I had built together now felt foreign. I tossed my keys on the counter and reached for the bottle of vodka we kept for special occasions. "How's that for a special occasion?" I poured a glass, added a squeeze of lemon, and downed it in one go. It burned, but I welcomed the heat. Anything to dull the ache in my chest. I poured another and kept drinking until the world dimmed, until the edges of my vision blurred and my thoughts slowed down enough for sleep to take over. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the front door opening. I squinted against the sunlight streaming through the windows and groaned as the pounding in my head kicked in. I felt sick physically and emotionally. Claire walked in, holding a tray with water, coffee, and 2 aspirin. She set it on the coffee table and knelt down beside the couch, her eyes red and swollen. She looked like she hadn't slept all night. "I made breakfast," she said softly, like her voice could somehow fix everything. The sight of her, so familiar yet so wrong in that moment, made something twist in my gut. The smell of the eggs and toast wafted in from the kitchen, and I had to fight the urge to retch. "Don't," I muttered, my voice hoarse. She sat back on her heels, unsure of what to do. "We need to talk." I shook my head. "There's nothing to talk about." Her lip quivered, and for a second, I thought she'd break down. But Claire was stronger than that. She took a breath and steadied herself. I know what you think you saw, but it wasn't what you're imagining. Johnny and we didn't cross that line. I let out a hollow laugh that tasted bitter. You really expect me to believe that? Yes, she said, her voice pleading. Because it's the truth. Claire, I saw you. My voice cracked, and I hated how small it made me feel. I saw how you looked when you came out of that room. She closed her eyes like she was trying to block out the memory. It was a stupid mistake. I never should have gone in there. I got caught up in everything, the drinks, the nostalgia, the attention. Her voice broke on that last word, and for the first time, I saw a real shame flicker across her face. But I didn't do what you think I did. I swear. I stared at her, trying to find even a sliver of the woman I'd trusted with my whole heart for 17 years. And maybe that was the worst part. She still looked like the same Claire I'd loved since I was 18. But something had shifted, like a pane of glass with a crack running down the middle. It hadn't shattered, but it was broken all the same. She reached for my hand, but I pulled back. Her touch felt like fire, and I didn't know if it was because I still wanted it or because I wanted to be free of it. You have to believe me, she whispered. I don't know if I can, I said, each word heavy with the weight of the truth. Her face crumpled, and tears slid down her cheeks. I'll do anything, therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. I'm not ready to lose us. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't ready either. That part of me was still holding on to the life we'd built. But another part of me, the part that had seen her stepping out of that room with him, was already gone. We sat there in the silence of our shared grief. I didn't know what was worse, the betrayal itself or the slow, inevitable unraveling of everything we'd been. That night, I slept in the guest room. Claire didn't try to stop me. She knew better. For the next few days, we tried to coexist in that strange, fragile space. We made dinner, watched TV in the same room, and even talked about small, meaningless things like work and errands. But the big things, the love, the trust, were missing. We were ghosts in the same house, passing through each other. Every time I looked at her, I thought about that night. And every time she looked at me, I saw the guilt she couldn't hide. I wasn't sure if this was the beginning of healing or the beginning of the end. The next few days passed in a haze of routine, but everything felt wrong. We went through the motions, ate breakfast, exchanged small talk, and tried to pretend that things were normal. But there was nothing normal about the way we avoided each other's eyes or how our conversations felt like performances we weren't invested in. The house was quiet in a way that suffocated me. Every creak of the floor, every clink of a plate sounded too loud, as if the silence between us made everything else deafening. Claire did her best to keep things together. She kept cooking meals for both of us, asking me if I needed anything, trying to make things feel familiar again. But I wasn't the same man anymore, and she wasn't the same woman I had spent half my life with. One evening, after another awkward, silent dinner, Claire finally broke. She set her fork down, her hands trembling slightly. I can't live like this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We're just drifting. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted from carrying the weight of everything that hadn't been said. I didn't have the strength to argue. What do you want me to say? She looked at me with tears threatening to fall. I want you to tell me if you're still in this, if we have any chance. Her question wasn't fair. How was I supposed to know the answer to that? I felt like I'd been walking through a fog since that night. Lost, confused, unsure of where I was going. Part of me wanted to cling to what we'd built, to believe that we could piece it all back together somehow. But the other part of me, the part that woke up every morning with that sick, hollow feeling, knew the truth. I don't know, I said finally. I don't know how to move past this. Claire covered her face with her hands, and I could hear her shaky breaths as she tried not to sob. I stared down at my empty plate, feeling like the worst person in the world, even though I knew this wasn't my fault. After a long moment, she stood up and walked to the living room, curling up on the couch like she was trying to make herself small enough to disappear. I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to be the man who could fix this, but I didn't know how. Instead, I went to the guest room, shut the door, and lay awake in the dark, replaying everything over and over again. The next morning, she was already up when I walked into the kitchen. She was wearing the hoodie I'd bought her years ago on a road trip, the one she always used to call her cozy armor. She was clutching a mug of coffee like it was the only thing holding her together. "I'm going to stay at Ashley's for a few days," she said, her voice flat. I didn't respond right away. I'd known this was coming, but it still hit harder than I expected. "Okay," I said quietly. She nodded, blinking back tears, and walked out of the room. I heard her upstairs, packing a bag, opening drawers and zipping things up. When she came back down, her bag was slung over her shoulder, and she hesitated near the door. "Please think about what you want," she said, her voice breaking just enough for me to notice. "Because I still believe in us." I wanted to believe too, but the words felt impossible to say. I gave her a small nod instead, and she opened the door and left. The house felt empty the second she was gone. I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, listening to the ticking of the clock. I wasn't sure if she was coming back or if this was the beginning of the end. The first night alone was unbearable. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. The absence of her footsteps, her voice, her presence. It all felt like an echo that wouldn't fade. I turned on the TV for noise, but it didn't help. Everything reminded me of her. The next few days blurred together. I went to work, I came home, I slept. Rinse and repeat. I avoided friends, ignored texts, and tried to convince myself that I needed this solitude to figure things out. But the truth was, I wasn't figuring anything out. I was just running from the decision I knew I'd have to make. Then, on the fourth day, Claire called. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button. My heart raced in my chest, but I hesitated. I knew if I answered, there'd be no more hiding, no more pretending that things would sort themselves out. I answered. Her voice was soft, tired. Hey, I replied, my throat dry. There was a long pause, and then she asked, "Can I come home?" Just to talk. I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath. I thought about all the times she'd said she was sorry, about all the ways we'd been slowly breaking apart. And yet, I still wanted to see her. No matter how shattered I felt, there was a part of me that needed to face her, to face us. "Yeah," I said. "Come home." Half an hour later, she walked through the door, her face pale and nervous. She set her bag down near the entryway and stood there, unsure of what to do. "I missed you," she whispered. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to say it back. We sat in the living room, and for the first time, we really talked. Not about logistics or small things, but about the night of the reunion, the years leading up to it, and all the cracks we'd ignored in our relationship. She told me how lost she'd felt, how she'd been searching for a way to feel like herself again. She cried as she confessed how much she hated herself for what happened. "I thought I'd lost you long before that night," she said, wiping her eyes. "I didn't know how to fix us." The weight of her words settled in the room like a heavy fog. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she'd been wrong, that I'd always been there. But the truth was I hadn't. We'd both been slowly pulling away without realizing it. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I said quietly, staring down at my hands. She nodded, more tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know." We sat there in silence for a long time. I didn't know what our future looked like. Maybe this was the start of something new, or maybe it was the final chapter. But for the first time in days, the air between us felt real. Messy and painful, but real. The days after Claire came home were some of the hardest we'd ever faced. We tried to fall back into our routines, work, dinner, mindless TV. But nothing felt the same. There was always something lurking under the surface, waiting to bubble over. Every glance, every awkward pause reminded me of what had happened. I could tell Claire was trying, that she was doing everything she could to rebuild what had broken. But trust isn't something you can glue back together in a day, or even a month. We started seeing a counselor at Claire's request. I wasn't thrilled about the idea at first, but I agreed. Part of me thought, what's the point? How can someone who's never met us tell us how to fix something so deeply personal? But the first session surprised me. The counselor didn't jump straight into what happened that night. Instead, she asked us to talk about the beginning, how we met, what made us fall in love, what kept us together. At first, it felt strange, like I was reading an old diary. But the more we talked, the more I remembered how strong we used to be. There was this flicker of warmth in those memories, but it was buried under layers of hurt. Claire talked about how she always admired me for being steady and dependable. "You've always been my anchor," she said, her voice cracking. But somewhere along the way, I felt like I wasn't enough. That hit me harder than I expected. I'd never thought of Claire as insecure. She'd always seemed so self-assured. But in that moment, I saw the version of her that I'd missed. The one who'd been struggling to feel seen. The counselor asked me to share my side. I hesitated, not because I didn't have feelings to share, but because I was afraid of how raw it would sound. Finally, I took a deep breath and let it out. I trusted her with everything, I said, my voice heavy with the weight of it all. And when I saw her in that room, it felt like she tore a piece of me out and handed it to someone else. Claire broke down in tears. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. And for the first time since that night, I didn't feel anger seeing her cry. I just felt tired. Tired of carrying all that pain. The sessions continued, and little by little, things began to shift. Not in a magical, everything's better now kind of way, but in small, almost imperceptible steps. We learned how to have hard conversations without shutting down. Claire listened more, and so did I. But even with the progress, I couldn't shake the lingering doubts. Every time her phone buzzed, I'd feel a pang of anxiety. Every time she smiled at someone else, I wondered if I'd ever be enough for her again. Then one night, Claire sat me down after dinner. The dishes were still on the table, the room dimly lit by the kitchen light. "I need to know where we stand," she said, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. "Because I can't keep living like this, not knowing if you're staying or going." Her words hung in the air. I felt like I was at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the decision I'd been too afraid to make. "I don't know if I can ever forget," I said, my throat tight. "But I still love you. That's the truth." Claire's face softened, and for a moment, I saw the woman I fell in love with. The one who made me laugh in that crowded dorm room when we had nothing but each other. But love wasn't the problem. It never was. It was the trust that was broken, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be fixed. We sat there in silence, letting the weight of everything settle. Then she reached across the table and held my hand. Her grip was firm, but not desperate. It felt like a promise. Not that things would be perfect, but that she wouldn't stop fighting for us. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't sleep in the guest room. I lay next to Claire, staring at the ceiling, listening to her steady breathing. The familiar sound should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up before her and made coffee. As I stood by the window, watching the sunrise, I felt different. Not healed, not whole, but lighter, somehow. Like I'd finally taken the first step toward whatever came next. Some days were better than others after that. There were moments where things felt normal again. Inside jokes, shared memories, small victories that reminded me why I loved her in the first place. But there were also setbacks. Sometimes I'd catch myself replaying that night in my head, the way she wiped her lipstick, the look on Johnny's face. And sometimes I'd wonder if we'd ever truly be okay again. One night, months later, we went out to dinner at a small restaurant by the water, a place we used to go to when we were younger. Claire looked at me across the table and smiled. Not the forced, guilty smile I'd gotten so used to, but something real. "I'm glad we're here," she said. "Me too," I replied, and for once, I wasn't lying. But as I watched her, I knew I'd never be the same man I was before. And maybe that was okay. Maybe what happened didn't need to define the rest of our lives. Maybe we'd never have that perfect trust again, but we'd learn how to rebuild, brick by brick, day by day. As we walked home that night, hand in hand, I realized something important. There's no such thing as going back to how things were. There's only moving forward, however messy and uncertain that might be. And if nothing else, we were still trying. No one tells you what happens after betrayal. People love stories of revenge or clean endings. Someone leaves, someone moves on, someone wins. But the truth? There are no winners. Just people trying to make sense of what's left. We weren't perfect. We were far from it. But we were still here. And maybe, for now, that was enough.